Hey, Judy, who boundary coach here at office hours, talking about some questions around boundaries. So one of the parts of the framework is figuring out how you adapted in your different developmental stages. So there are three main ones that we usually just keep track of. And um, to give some credit, this was adapted from Richard Schwartz's Inner Family Systems. Personally, and professionally, I find IFS, internal family systems, to be a little too complicated. I get overwhelmed in tracking all the different parts. So, what I've done in my framework is simplify it to the different developmental stages. So, one of the questions I often ask my clients within groups is who's driving the bus? And basically, I've narrowed it down to three who are the most active in driving, and that is the little one. So the wounded child is like elementary age. So for that developmental stage, young children like toddler through early elementary school, their boundaries are really, really porous. And by porous, I mean there's no separation between them and the other person. So boundaries are a way to understand. It's like, where do I end and where does the other person begin? For young children, and due to the lack of brain development and the task, which is to attach to somebody so that they'll continue to take care of you as a young child because you're completely dependent on them. They're very porous and they're getting data from their primary caregivers on how they should feel about themselves and the world. Okay. So, they're going to be looking at the primary things that we've been talking about, the like, is it okay for me to be imperfect? Right? That's the rights of a child. Um, can I trust that I will be protected from abuse or neglect? And can I be spontaneous and do what I want as long as I don't intrude or harm another person? Um, do I understand as a young child that I'm allowed to be dependent, or not allowed? I am completely dependent on my caregiver to provide me my needs and my wants. Um, and so those are the types of things that children in their different developmental stages are trying to figure out. So our youngest part, the wounded child, it's not accurate because we can have a baby as well, but to simplify things, the wounded child's main task is to figure out their worldview, our worldview. So whenever I'm like asking you, like, how was it for you? Um, it's because I'm trying to prompt how your young childhood was, and for you to pause it, for you to guess and see how it feels in your body when you guess it. What is my worldview? Am I loved? Am I safe? Do I have to be perfect? Am I protected? Right? The other piece about the wounded child is they internalize everything is about them. There's a phrase called magical thinking. So for young children, they take everything personally. So if, the sun's shining and they want to do this thing or go somewhere, they're assuming on some level that everyone's going to be doing this, or everyone's family is just like mine, right? Um, the next developmental stage that we try to discern is the adaptive tween. And so in our tween years, that is when our bodies hit puberty and start to develop into adults so that our bodies can reproduce. However, our brains are still much more childlike than they are adult-like. And so the task of tween years, or puberty years, so this is like late elementary school through middle school, and early high school, is the focus is on belonging. So remember how a young child, their focus is on attachment to their caregiver, tweens start to shift their focus from their caregiver to their peer group. Because as animals, we need a herd to belong. So if we lived in a healthy environment, we would have an environment that allowed us to explore who we were in its entirety. That would include like my gender and sexuality, how I like to dress, what kind of foods I like, what are my, interests in life, what are my values. This is the time to really explore everything. And then once we determine who we are, which can change, right? Then naturally we would attract people who would celebrate us to be close, and then we would form our social group. But because our society is so messed up, and what we've been taught is we look to see which social group we might fit into. All right. And for many people who have been marginalized or oppressed, it's really about how do I fit into this group so I can have some social standing and some protection. And so they're going to be juggling between wanting to please their caregivers and wanting to please their friends. Okay. The last adaptation, and the most prominent in most of us, okay, is the adaptive teen. And so this is the brain development starts to really go into full force in the frontal lobe. So this is like mid-high school through college. So our brains don't fully develop till mid-20s. So I just want to pause on that. Our brains do not fully develop until mid-20s. So the expectations that we have on our children, especially our 18-year-olds who are full adults, is unrealistic. Okay. So in teen years, the frontal lobe is fully developing. Folks who have ADHD, and so their executive functioning part of the brain is delayed by 3 years, catches up at this stage. Okay. Their task, teenagers' task, is to differentiate from their primary caregivers. Okay. And the reason why they need to differentiate, that this is why it's like the teenage angst and like parents are constantly fighting with their teenagers. It's so that they can differentiate and figure out who they really are. Okay, as their own person, as an adult. So for teens, they're practicing being an adult. What's unfortunate is because we live in a society based on white body supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, this toxic society prevents us from fully maturing into functional adults. Okay, so oftentimes, and we can look at Congress, the legislature, and all this madness that's happening in the world, we get stunted. And so we think we're adults, but we're actually behaving as teenagers. Okay. So adaptive teens have internalized how they were parented and the beliefs that they've ingested from this society. Okay. So wounded child, adaptive tween, and adaptive teen. So just giving an example, because it can be really hard to distinguish internally. So if any of you have been really confused about what the F I'm trying to teach, that makes total sense. And I would be the first to admit and acknowledge I might not be explaining this in a very, very clear manner. And so I like to create case scenarios because it's sometimes easier to look at like a neutral party to see what's happening. Because it's also, I think a lot of people, me included, it's hard to make mistakes. So kind of like looking at ourselves can sometimes be triggering. So here's a case study or a scenario for us to look at together. You're on a date at a nice restaurant and the dish you ordered is wrong. You don't want to say anything, but your date insists on telling the server. And when they call the server over, your date actually is very condescending and reprimands the server for getting your dish wrong, but in a very condescending way. In the story I make up, it might be that way because, the date was trying to prove that they could protect or, wanted to impress you. Okay. So the question is, who's driving the bus in this scenario? For everybody, because everyone's got someone who's driving the bus, right? And our task is to figure out for ourselves, based on our knowledge about our own family of origin information and our own understanding of our development as children, who's driving my bus. Okay. Do not try to figure out who's driving the other person's bus as a diagnostic. I've been suggesting to everyone on the one-on-one calls, consider this. This is the story I make up. How is that for you? Because what I'm trying to do is not to assess you or to diagnose you. What I'm trying to do is get you to start looking at your childhood and figure out what worldviews you created so you can start seeing that matrix, right? That belief system. And so questioning it and understanding it in a different way gives you power, because what you're doing is you're becoming a detective in your own life to uncover who you really are. Again, it is near impossible for anyone to be fully who they are in a society like this. Okay, so you're on a date at a restaurant. The dish you ordered is wrong. You don't want to say anything, but your date insists on telling the server. And when the date gets the attention of the server, they reprimand the server pretty disrespectfully and condescendingly about getting your dish wrong. Okay. So let's start with you. Who's driving the bus? You do not want to let anyone know that your dish is wrong. Yes, absolutely. It's the little child, right? Because the wounded child, possibly the adaptive teen, doesn't feel like they have much power. It's not a big deal. I don't have to. I don't need to protect myself, or I can just eat it anyway. It's whatever, So that's that part. It might be the adaptive teen, like if you're always trying to fawn, but my wondering is, I think this might be someone's wounded child, okay, or adaptive teen. It is not like there is a handbook with an answer guide at the back. The goal is not perfection. The goal is not getting this exactly right. The goal is starting to understand. If I can posit who's driving my bus and it's not my functional adult, it'll give me then information how to regulate myself. Okay. So the homework from the last class was to start practicing these self-regulation tools so your body can start to understand or even feel a little bit of relief from this constant stress that is our society today. Okay. And for the date, right, calls the server over and reprimands them disrespectfully, right? Who's driving their bus? Yeah. The story I make up is that it's probably their adaptive teen, right? Kind of showcasing or showing their power, like dehumanizing the wait staff because they're servers, right? If we go back to these circles, the goal of boundary healing that I understand that I'm trying to teach you in this group is that everyone is as important as you. No more, no less. No one takes priority. Everyone is as important as the other person, including if you're a server. including if you get something wrong, you are the same as. What we've been taught in society is if I get it wrong, my value diminishes, or I'm stupid, or I'm incapable, or I'm not qualified, or whatever, right? What we have to, I mean, we don't have to. What I'm saying is to how to heal our boundaries is we need to learn that our value is unconditional, regardless of our job, regardless if we get it right or wrong, regardless of the relationship. If I don't know you on the street, you are still as important as me. I cannot, I mean, I can, but if I look down on someone just because they're, looking like riffraff on the street, that's me oppressing someone else. That's me looking at them like this. That's not okay because they are as important as me. Let's do a sidebar. What's happening in Palestine right now is exactly the dehumanization that every body of color has experienced. It's the same as what happened to the indigenous people on this land. We are witnessing genocide happen over again. And it is literally this, but it's not literally this. It's literally the adaptive teenager, right? And the Palestinian people, right? So Israel, the government, not all Israeli people, not Jewish people, the government, those in power, the US in power who refused to do a ceasefire is absolutely behaving from their adaptive teenager, consumed with resource hoarding, consumed with being right, consumed with never acknowledging that they were wrong, consumed with morphing the narrative so that they come out on top, even though people are seeing with their eyes what's really happening on the ground, right? And these people are being murdered, right? So why am I constantly like, who's driving your bus? Or how did this happen in your childhood? It's not good or bad. I'm not blaming your parents. I'm not saying you had a shitty childhood. What I'm saying is, where did you get your narrative? Where did you get your narrative? So if the narrative for the people who were given Israel was, this is your promised land, they're going to take up that space that was promised to them, right? And so the goal of boundary healing is, how do I start to see myself as fully human, no more and no less than anybody else, regardless of if we like them or not, regardless of what they can give us or not, that we view each other as whole, perfect, brilliant human beings, right? And that's how we stop the passing on of oppression. Let's look at another scenario. Your boss has very high standards and needs to know what each person is doing at all times. So there are lots of meetings that get scheduled, last minute asks of reworking your slide deck and adjusting your presentation. And one day your boss calls you into their office and questions your decisions about a particular project that you own. Who's driving the bus? And let's complicate things because you're ready, right? Which rights of a child are being triggered? So your boss has very high standards and needs to know what each person is doing. and calls you into their office and questions your decisions about a particular project that you own. This is basically micromanaging. Which rights of the child are being triggered? Let's start there first. I'm going to share. Oops. So the rights of a child are, you're allowed to be imperfect. And that your value is not contingent on a great slide deck or appeasing your boss in any way. The other thing that I might think of is your right to be spontaneous and open. So if you had a particular way that you wanted to present the thing and your boss is like, no, don't do it in that way, that's not allowing you your perspective. Okay. And so now who's driving the bus? Let's start with you. And so again, this depends on the person who's in the office, right? Because it might be their adaptive teenagers going to respond in different ways, right? So if I were to use it for me, knowing my history of a highly critical parent who would threaten to either kick me out of the house, disown me, or harm themselves, my teenager gets activated and is like type A, super controlling, super perfect, and super like, yes, whatever you need me to do. Oh, I'm so sorry, I messed it up. Okay. So my teenager is overcompensating, always trying to be perfect, always trying to please the other person, and, you know, highly critical of myself. And the other one who's trying to like fight over the wheel is my wounded child, right? Who feels that my worth is contingent on being liked, right? My wounded child always felt that they had to be perfect in order to be loved and didn't feel like they could set boundaries and say, this is what I made this decision because this is what I think that we should do, right? I would not have, my wounded child does not know that that is a right. Okay. And so for me, driving that bus, if I'm called into my boss's office who's highly critical and questioning a judgment of mine, I would jump to between teenager and little one, where my teenager would blame the little one for making a mistake. And then let's think about the boss, right? Might have the same adaptation. If they're highly controlling or critical, they likely did not have a childhood with a loving parent who allowed them to make mistakes, who trusted their judgment. We're not going to be controlling if we had a foundation of unconditional love. We're not going to have, you know, lack of faith in other people if we were trusted growing up. And so the other side of this is, as we do our boundary healing and give ourselves compassion for the ways that we've adapted, we're also going to see the other person as human. I'm going to go, I wonder why my boss is so micromanaging, rather than go into my teen and be like, he's such a jerk, or they're such a jerk, right? What the fuck? I'm going to start to go, I wonder why this is happening. And then that's also going to inform how I set boundaries and speak to my boss. Right. And that's what we're building towards as we learn these different steps that don't make sense right now. And that's totally fine. We have to give ourselves compassion right now because we are in the middle of global chaos, which is triggering every person who has experienced collective trauma. So for me, right, whose parent never took accountability or responsibility and always prioritized their ego and how they were perceived over the safety of their children, what's happening in Palestine is triggering me because I'm witnessing another authority figure completely fail their people by harming other people and then thinking it's okay. Story I make up, I'm not the only one in this group that has that story. Again, not me analyzing any of you, me inviting you to try this framework to see if it's going to be helpful and offer you some relief. Because once we understand why we behave the way we behave, we understand that it was adaptive, which means it worked for us. It is no small feat to survive the programming and the toxicity and the impossibility of the world that it is today. It is no small feat. So if you've gotten here, kudos to you. No matter how you feel about yourself, you have made it to this day and age. So that means something worked. You did something right. And so this class, this group is about understanding what worked and why. And likely the way that you adapted is also keeping you from authenticity, freedom, and vulnerability to connect with others in a way that feels healthy and boundaried. So let's do one last question, scenario. Let me stop share and read this to you. Your parent calls you and they had a fight with either your other parent or a sibling. Okay. You just want to just fill in for your scenario. Okay. Parent calls you, they had a fight with someone that you know, and they need to vent. I can't believe your sister, brother, sibling, other parent did this. They're so worthless. They're always doing this, blah, 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 blah. Okay. They just want to vent to you. What are the rights of a child being triggered? And who's driving the bus? So pull up the thing again. Rights of a child. Okay. Yes. Unconditionally loved, right? Because the parent is talking ill of the person that they're venting about, right? Which means they don't value that person as unconditional and lovable no matter what, right? They have to be perfect. So there's not any space for allowance of, mistakes or being human or being whatever, right? Yes, the vulnerability, understanding that every person has a right to be protected from abuse and neglect. Venting to you and shaming this other person is not protecting them from emotional abuse. Because I'm witnessing how they speak about this person. And the story I would make up, and you should assume, is if someone's talking about someone else in this demeaning, dehumanizing way, they will, I would bet money, talk about you that way too behind your back if you do something that pisses them off. And this would then go to the next one, which is every child needs to know that they're dependent. If I had a parent who was talking about someone like that, I would not feel like I could depend on them safely, right? So I would either learn to be anti-dependent, which I think some of you are, because the story I make up, not diagnosing, I'm making up stories. They can be wrong. I'm not invested in being right. I'm just wanting to make sure that you are using this space in the ways that are helpful for you. And I know a lot's going on, right? But if we had parents that were not dependable, one of the adaptations is anti-dependence, which means not asking for help, not letting someone know that you hurt them in some way. Right? That distance, that anti-dependence, like I don't need anyone, creates a sense of safety because I won't get let down by somebody else. Okay. Another way of adapting around this dependent, like knowing that a child knowing that they're allowed to be dependent, they have to be dependent in some ways, right? Another adaptation is codependence. So that's the opposite end. So codependence means if I do something, if I save this person, if I make them feel good, then I'm a good person. Right? My sense of self or my worth is dependent on anything external is what I view as codependent. Okay. And then back to that example. Parent calls, vents about someone else in a very, demeaning, dehumanizing way. Who's driving the bus? So I'm going to use myself as an example again, because you all know a little bit about my history that I'm sharing with you. And I intentionally use my experience to be transparent, not because I'm trying to get you to feel for me in any way. I am supposed to take care of myself. So don't do that. What I'm doing is I'm modeling how to use this framework. And if any of you are like, gosh, I know you better than I know myself, I've been working on this for a really, really, really long time. Right? You know, when kids are learning to walk and they keep falling over, that's what learning is. So if you're not getting this, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. Okay? And maybe I'm explaining things that don't work for you. Reach out to me in WhatsApp and say, hey, I don't understand this. Can you explain it in a different way? Absolutely, I can explain it in a different way. So who's driving the bus? So for me, answering the phone from a parent who's going to be disrespectful about my sibling, it's going to be my adaptive teen on the line and gossiping, or tween, right? Gossiping, like, oh yeah, I can't believe you did that, blah, blah, blah. Because before I did my healing work, I would do that and feel close to my mom, right? Because I could talk with my mom and say, oh yeah, this is how I think he should parent instead, or why does he do that, X, Y, Z, right? It creates a false closeness. It's not real. That is not real intimacy, to join and align by talking ill about someone else. Because what you're not doing is sharing about yourself with somebody else. Right? If the conversation was, oh, when he does that, this is how it makes me feel, and I wish we could have a better relationship. That is absolutely different, because you're talking about your own experience and what's coming up for you and your hopes around that relationship. That's an adult, mature conversation with another person who would then receive that sharing as like, well, that makes total sense that you feel that way and that you want a closer relationship together. Have you seen ways that it's felt close before? Would you like to hear some suggestions on how you could approach a conversation with them to get your point across? That is a mature conversation. But to throw someone else under the bus, teenager. To criticize, teenager. To demean, teenager. And so the story I make up about a parent who would do that, they're also toggling between their inner teen and their wounded child. One of the clusterfucks of parenting is that there's this expectation or some kind of this like unconscious expectation that my child is an extension of myself. So if they're successful, then I'm good. If they do what I say, then I'm good. If they love me, then I'm good, right? Our children are not extensions of ourselves. They are complete whole human beings with a life path all of their own. They need that freedom. Love is freedom. Love is not control. Love is not manipulation. I'll only love you if you change in this way. I'll only, extend this if you can understand me. That's not love. That's an adaptation. Okay, so that'll be your teenager or your wounded child. Because a wounded child internalizes and personalizes everything. So if my child or my parent doesn't do this thing, then it's reflective of me, my worth. They don't care about me, or I'm not good enough, right? That's our wounded child. And often, and this is the tricky part, often our adaptive teenagers are parenting our little children. Either the tween, oh my God, you're so disgusting, or like, you're ugly, right? Shaming. That's going to be a teenager trying to reparent or trying to parent or control the tween or the wounded child. And part of the work that we're going to learn is how to regulate not only our own bodies. What we're going to do is we're going to learn how to reparent those little ones so that we can give them what they've always needed. We do not need to rework our childhood and fix everything. What we can do right now is reparent our inner adaptive parts so that we can mature and grow our functional adult. And that functional adult will be able to go out in the world and treat each other with kindness, right? So let's go back through all the scenarios as a closing, okay? So what would a functional adult do in receiving that phone call with a parent who just wants to vent about a sibling? Hey, Mom, it sounds like you're really upset. I trust that whatever, sibling did really upset you, and I'm so sorry. I can't hear the feedback that you're having about my sibling in this way because it hurts my relationship. Would it be okay if we talked about what's coming up for you? That would make me feel better and closer to you. Because I want to be able to be free to have a relationship with my sibling and you. Okay? That doesn't, then I don't need my parent to be like, okay. If my parent's like, what do you mean? He's always like this. He does this to you too. Their response informs my next boundary, which is our next class, which is about boundaries, to understand what boundaries are. Okay. What's the functional adult response to the boss who calls you in and is questioning your decision? Thank you so much for calling me in and making some time. Can I just ask a few questions? When you're asking me to change these slides so many times, the story I make up is that you have a clear vision of how this should go. Is that the case? If that's the case, can you just tell me so that I don't have to keep redoing this? Or another request could be, I have a different perspective on this. And you've hired me to do this job and work with the clients. And so is there something that makes you think that my strategy is not going to work? Right? A functional adult is going to not try to be right. A functional adult is going to try to be known. And to know the other. This is a story making. Is that accurate? Oh, no, 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 no. I'm actually really anxious about this. Yeah, me too. And the more you tell me to change it, the more anxious I am. I don't think you intend to do that. Oh, yeah, right? A functional adult is going to treat the other person in their humanity, communicate in a way that's non-oppressive and non-controlling, and they're going to share to be known, not to be right. Nonviolent communication is another class closer to the end. But I'm teaching you bits and pieces along the way, but I'm just chunking down the content. Okay. Then the functional adult response to being on a date, getting their food wrong, the date calls the server over and reprimands them. And a functional adult would go, oh my gosh, hold on 1 second. Thank you so much. I'd look at the date. Thank you so much for trying to fix this for me. I really appreciate it's okay. I'm okay. I assume the server did not cook the meal. And so I want to make sure that you don't feel, server, that we're blaming you for this. I'm so sorry if that's the case. We're on our first date and we're just a little nervous. And this dish is wrong. Can you get me the right dish? Do you hear that everyone is valued there? What we're doing is, this dish is wrong. Mistakes are okay. Doesn't make you stupid. You don't have to talk to people like that, right? So that is what we're working towards. And I hope these scenarios or case studies help a little bit, because if you're not understanding this, you're not the only one. So reach out to me in the one-on-one, because everyone has a different learning style, right? And it's really hard for me to adjust. That's why yeah. My strong suit is not like teaching, okay? I'm just trying my best to kind of teach this in a way that a larger group that has lots of different childhood experiences and lots of different ways of learning to get this framework. I don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect. But we do need to work on this to figure out, right? We don't need to. I mean, if you've bitten off, is that right? More than you can chew with your schedule right now, that's totally okay. Right? But I'm just wanting to, sometimes I push because I'm like, you got me for a limited time. Like, I'm here, including like, I don't get this and I don't really I'm having this issue right now. What I can do is I can help frame it based on what we're doing. Like, if you think it's not related to what we're learning, the struggle you're having right now, it is. Because likely it's based on how you're viewing the situation, which is through the lens of our adaptive parts. And so as you learn how to view the situation from this lens that I'm coaching you towards, I'm teaching you how to get there, it is going to relieve stress from your body, because you are going to be learning to access your prefrontal cortex, which is your fully resourced part of your brain, which is where the functional adult in my mind lives. It will change your life because you will use your body differently than you have before. Thank you so much for coming. And I take good care.